In the climate-controlled vault of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, beneath layers of modern security and archival precision, sits a clay tablet no larger than your open palm. Its catalogue number is CBS 10673. The surface bears the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay more than 4,000 years ago in the ancient city of Nippur. But this tablet does not contain a poem. It does not record a transaction or a prayer. Instead, it lists names connected by relationships, arranged in a hierarchy that reads less like mythology and more like what you might find in a genealogical archive. Parent to child, husband to wife, brother to sister, generation after generation. The scribe who created this tablet used a very specific term for the beings documented within, the Anunnaki. In Sumerian, the word breaks down as Anunnaki, literally, those of royal blood descended from Anu, not metaphorically descended, not spiritually related. The grammar suggests lineage in the most literal sense. Children of Anu, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a family tree extending backward through time to a point where the records themselves seem to dissolve into something older than memory. This is not the only such tablet. Scattered across museums in London, Oxford, New Haven and Paris are dozens more god lists, as scholars call them. The most comprehensive, known as Anaku Anum, contains nearly 2,000 entries, not 2,000 stories, 2,000 names organised by family relationship. The first 4 tablets of this massive compilation are devoted entirely to mapping out who descended from whom, who married whom, how power transferred through generations. The scribes who assembled this list worked with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to recording grain shipments and land sales. They were archivists of bloodlines. Modern scholarship treats these texts as mythological pantheons, symbolic representations of cosmic forces, poetic personifications of natural phenomena, the sky god, the earth goddess, the storm, the sea. This interpretation is reasonable. It fits comfortably within our understanding of how ancient peoples explained their world. But the tablets themselves resist this simplicity. They insist on detail. They specify birth order. They note which wife bore which children. They document family disputes, territorial divisions among siblings, marriages arranged between rival branches. They record with extraordinary care the names of children born to unions between what the texts call Anunnaki and what they distinctly refer to as humans. What if these tablets are exactly what they appear to be? What if the Sumerians were not inventing a mythology, but preserving a genealogy? What if they inherited these records from an earlier time and felt compelled, obligated even, to copy them generation after generation, maintaining an archive of bloodlines that predated their own civilization? The question sits in that cool vault, alongside CBS 1I673, unanswered. Wherever you are right now, whether it's dawn breaking outside your window or deep night settling in, whether you're in Tokyo or Toronto, Mumbai or Mexico City, take a moment and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. This investigation spans multiple museums, multiple languages, and multiple millennia. It seems fitting to know where in the world you are as we begin to trace a family tree that, according to the tablets themselves, once ruled this entire planet. Let us start at the beginning, not with Anu, not even with the sky and the earth, but with what the tablets describe as existing before the first generation, before the names, before the bloodline that would become the Anunnaki. In the darkness before creation, according to the Mesopotamian scribes, there was something else, and from that something else the family tree began, before the first city. The 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, discovered among the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, begin not with gods, but with water. 2 kinds of water. Apsu, the fresh water that flows beneath the earth, deep and still and ancient. Tiamat, the salt water churning and endless, personified as female. The text states clearly, when on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mummu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. This is not poetry about oceans. This is a genealogical record attempting to describe what existed before the first generation, the primordial pair from which all subsequent beings emerged. The tablets use familial language. Apsu is described as begetter, Tiamat as she who bore them all. The terminology of parenthood applied to something that predates the categories we usually associate with parents and children. From the commingling of these two primordial forces came the first generation that the tablets identify with discrete names and characteristics. Lahmu and Lahamu, twin deities, brother and sister, born from the union of Apsu and Tiamat. The names themselves offer something unusual. Lahmu has been translated variously as the muddy one or the silt. In Akkadian texts, Lahmu can refer to a hairy, primitive being, sometimes depicted as protective spirits. Lahamu, the feminine counterpart, carries similar connotations. These are not elegant sky gods. They are described in earthy, almost crude terms, beings of silt and sediment, of the boundary between water and solid ground. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions Lahmu creatures guarding the gateway to the cedar forest, not as gods, but as sentries, powerful but subordinate. This dual usage presents an interpretive problem. Are Lahmu and Lahamu in the Enuma Elish the same category of being as the protective spirits called Lahmu in later texts, or did the later usage borrow the name from earlier, more significant figures? The tablets do not clarify. They simply state Lahmu and Lahamu were born, and from them came the next generation, Anshar and Kishar, the twin horizons, Anshar whole heaven, Kishar whole earth. Here the language shifts from silt and mud to cosmic principles. Anshar represents the totality of the sky, the celestial expanse. Kishar embodies the entirety of Earth's surface, horizon and horizon, the upper and lower boundaries of the visible world, brother and sister, like their parents, husband and wife, continuing the pattern of sibling pairing that characterizes these earliest generations. What is striking about this progression, Apsu and Tiamat, to Lahmu and Lahamu, to Anshar and Kishar, is the movement from elemental forces towards something increasingly differentiated. Water becomes silt, becomes defined boundaries between sky and earth. The language evolves from describing substances to describing spaces, from what things are made of to where things exist. And from Anshar and Kishar came the figure who would become the patriarch of the Anunnaki bloodline, Anu. But here the tablets present us with a complication, one that will recur throughout this investigation. Different texts from different periods preserve different traditions about Anu's origins. In the Enuma Elish, Anu is clearly identified as the son of Anshar and Kishar. This is the Babylonian tradition, recorded in the 1st millennium BC. But older Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BC present a different genealogy. In these earlier sources, Anu, written as An in Sumerian, is not the son of Anshar and Kishar. Instead, An and Ki are themselves the primordial pair. They are the beginning. An is the sky, Ki is the earth. From their union, everything else descends. The scholarly consensus attributes this discrepancy to the evolution of religious thought across centuries. As political power shifted from Sumerian city-states to the Akkadian Empire to the Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms, the mythology was revised, expanded, and recontextualized. New generations of gods were inserted at the beginning of the lineage, pushing Anu back from primordial father to 3rd generation descendant. This makes sense as a historical process. Cultures revise their origin stories. But another reading is possible. What if these are not contradictory accounts of mythology, but fragmented records of an actual genealogy, preserved imperfectly across time? Family records can be lost, rediscovered, and integrated into existing knowledge in ways that create apparent contradictions. If you found your great-great-grandfather's family Bible and discovered it listed ancestors you'd never heard of, ancestors that pushed your known lineage back 2 more generations, would that make your existing family tree mythology, or would it mean your records were incomplete? The Enuma Elish continues with the narrative of conflict, how the younger gods became noisy, disturbing Apsu's rest, how Apsu plotted to destroy them, how Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, learned of the plot and killed Apsu first. This portion reads like political intrigue, succession crisis, generational power struggle. Tiamat, grieving and enraged, raised an army to avenge Apsu. She created monsters, 11 types, the tablets specify, and appointed Kingu, her new consort, as leader. She gave Kingu the tablets of destiny, the supreme authority to decree fate. The younger gods, terrified, turned to Marduk, the son of Ea. Marduk agreed to face Tiamat, but demanded in return that he be made supreme king of the gods. The assembly agreed. Marduk defeated Tiamat, split her body in half, used one half to create the sky and the other to form the earth, and established the cosmic order. For this victory, Marduk was elevated to head of the pantheon. He became, in Babylonian theology, the supreme deity, higher even than Anu, his great-grandfather. This narrative has been analysed as mythologized cosmology, as political propaganda for Babylon's rise to power, as philosophical meditation on order versus chaos. All valid interpretations. But strip away the interpretive framework and look at what the text actually describes. A family succession crisis resolved through violence, followed by a reordering of authority that elevated a younger family member over his elders based on military victory and political negotiation. The god list in Anum, compiled in the 1st millennium BC but drawing on much older sources, attempts to organise this complex genealogy into a systematic hierarchy. The list begins with Anu and his court, then Enlil, then Ninhursag, then Enki. Each major deity is followed by their spouse, their children, their attendants, and their associated divine servants. The structure mirrors the organisation of royal archives: the king, his household, his administrators, his military commanders, each with their subordinates. Tablet 1 of Anarchanum opens with Anu and lists his various names and epithets across different languages and traditions. Then it lists his consort, but here the text acknowledges variance. In some traditions, Anu's wife is Antu. In others, she is identified with Urat. In still others, with Ki herself. The compilers of this list did not resolve these contradictions. They recorded them all as if preserving competing family records that claimed different matriarchs. The next entries list the children of Anu. The text names Enlil first, then Ea Enki, then the goddess Bau, then a deity named Martu. The list continues with more children, some well known, others obscure names that appear nowhere else in the surviving literature. Why would mythological compilers include gods no one worshipped, gods with no temples, no stories, no function in the religious life of Mesopotamia, unless the point was not theological utility but genealogical completeness? Unless the compilers were attempting to document every member of a bloodline, not just the prominent ones. The pattern established in these primordial generations, sibling marriage, twin births, the transfer of authority from father to son, or the seizure of authority through conflict, would repeat throughout the subsequent generations of the Anunnaki bloodline. The structure was set. What began with Apsu and Tiamat, or with An and Ki, depending on which tradition you follow, would extend forward through time, each generation producing the next, until the bloodline reached a point where it intersected with human kingship itself. But before we can trace those later generations, we must understand the central couple more clearly, Anu and Ki, An and Earth, the patriarch and matriarch of the line that would be called, for all subsequent history, the children of Anu, the Anunnaki, the children of heaven and earth. His name appears in the earliest written documents from Mesopotamia, An, the Sumerian word for sky. The cuneiform sign for his name is the same as the sign for God itself, a star 8-pointed representing heaven. An was not the god of the sky in the way that later deities would preside over specific domains. He was sky, the totality of it, the expanse above, infinite and unreachable, the boundary beyond which even thought struggles to pass. The University of Pennsylvania's Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses database, an exhaustive scholarly resource maintained by the ORAC project, states that in 3rd millennium Sumerian texts, An held the position of supreme deity in the pantheon. Kings called upon his name to legitimize their rule. Temples were built in his honor at Uruk, the ancient city in southern Iraq, whose ruins still rise from the desert like broken teeth. The temple was called Iana, the house of heaven. But An was, even in the earliest texts, a distant figure. He did not intervene in human affairs with the regularity of Enlil or Enki. He decreed from above, but did not descend. His authority was ultimate, but his presence was remote. He was invoked, honoured, and obeyed, but not approached. In the mythology, when the younger gods had disputes, they did not go to An, they went to Enlil. An remained above, presiding but not participating. This remoteness has led scholars to suggest that An represents an older stratum of belief, a primordial sky god gradually pushed to the periphery as more active deities took centre stage in the religious life of Mesopotamia. By the time of the Babylonian period, An, called Anu in Akkadian, had been largely supplanted by Marduk or Enlil, depending on the city. But his name remained first in all the god lists. His genealogical position was never disputed. He was the father. Everything descended from him. His consort is more complicated. In Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BC, the goddess Urash appears as An's wife. Urash is associated with earth, with fertile ground, with the productive surface of the world. Her name appears in administrative texts and hymns, always linked to An. But by the 2nd millennium, a different name dominates, Ki. In Sumerian, Ki simply means earth or ground. It is the opposite and complement of An, sky and earth, the two fundamental divisions of reality. In some creation accounts, An and Ki are the primordial parents of all the gods. They are not born from anyone, they simply are. From their separation, the pulling apart of heaven and earth, the space for creation opens. Their children are born into the gap between sky and ground, inhabiting the middle realm where air moves and life exists. But in later Akkadian traditions, particularly in Babylonian religious texts, Anu's consort is named Antu. The name is simply the feminine form of Anu, a linguistic pairing that emphasizes symmetry. Antu appears in rituals, in temple dedications, in prayers. She is given offerings alongside Anu. She has her own attendants, her own epithets, but she does not have stories. There are no myths about Antu's actions, her desires, her conflicts. She exists in the texts as Anu's complement, his necessary counterpart, the feminine principle balancing the masculine, but not as an independent agent. This raises a question that runs through all genealogical research, whether ancient or modern, when a figure appears under different names, are we dealing with the same individual described differently, or with different individuals whose records have been conflated? Urash, Ki and Antu, are these three names for one goddess, reflecting different aspects or different periods of worship, or are they three separate consorts of an Anu, representing different lineages, different marriages, different branches of the family tree? The compilers of Anak or Anuum seemed uncertain themselves. The god list includes Antu as Anu's primary consort, but notes variants. Some manuscripts specify Urash. Others equate Ki with Antu, treating them as two names for the same figure. The text does not resolve the issue, it records the ambiguity. From a mythological perspective, this ambiguity is unremarkable. Gods acquire new epithets, absorb the attributes of other deities, merge and split as religious practice evolves. But from a genealogical perspective, the question of maternity is critical. Because the children attributed to Anu, the first generation of the Anunnaki proper, differ slightly depending on which tradition you follow. The most consistent accounts agree on certain figures. Enlil is always listed as a son of Anu. So is Enki, though his mother is sometimes specified as Namu, a goddess associated with the primordial sea. So is Bau, a healing goddess linked to the city of Lagash. So is Ninhursag, though her relationship to the family becomes even more complex, as we will see. Tablet 1 of Anankwanum lists approximately 20 children of Anu. Most of these names appear nowhere else in the surviving literature. There are no temples for them, no myths, no cult practices. They are listed simply as offspring of Anu, recorded alongside their more famous siblings. If the purpose of the god list were theological, to document the gods actually worshipped in Mesopotamia, why include these obscure names? Why preserve the memory of deities who played no role in religious life? One possible answer: because the list is not primarily theological, it is genealogical. Its purpose is to document the complete bloodline, not just the prominent members. In royal lineages, scribes recorded every child born to the king, not only those who inherited the throne or achieved political significance. The others still mattered for purposes of succession, marriage alliance, and dynastic legitimacy. If the Anunnaki bloodline operated under similar principles, then every child of Anu would need to be recorded, even those who founded no cities, performed no cosmic deeds, left no mark on the mythology. The British Museum holds a clay tablet catalogued as 17308, an old Babylonian hymn that invokes 4 deities in sequence: Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninmah. The text is written in Sumerian with an Akkadian interlinear translation, suggesting it was copied during a period when Sumerian was no longer a living language but was maintained for religious purposes. The hymn praises each deity's role in creation and governance, but what is notable is the grouping: Anu the father, followed by 3 children who represent the 3 primary domains. Enlil receives the air, the atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth. Enki receives the waters, the Apsu below, the rivers and marshes, the deep sources. Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, receives a more ambiguous domain. She is associated with birth, with the formation of living things, with the mountains where the gods gather. This triad, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag, appears repeatedly across Mesopotamian texts as the primary divine administrators of the world. They are the great gods who made decisions, who acted upon the earth, who shaped the course of both divine and human history. But their exact relationship to each other and to their father Anu varies across sources. In some texts, they are full siblings, all children of Anu and Ki. In others, Enki's mother is Namu, making him a half-brother. In still others, Ninhursag is not Anu's daughter, but his granddaughter, which would make her the niece of Enlil and Enki, and simultaneously their consort, a pattern that, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, is not uncommon in royal bloodlines seeking to maintain purity or concentrate divine attributes. The confusion is compounded by the fact that Ninhursag herself appears under at least 6 different names in Sumerian and Akkadian texts: Ninmah Great Queen, Ninhursag Yedi of the Mountain, Nintud, Yedi who gives birth, Nintur, Mama, and Beletili. Each name emphasizes a different aspect of her role, but all clearly refer to the same figure. She is the mother goddess, the birth giver, the one who shapes living forms from clay, a role central to several creation accounts. In the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian composition dating to around 1700 BC, Ninhursag, called Mami in this text, creates human beings by mixing clay with the blood of a slaughtered god. The text describes the process in procedural detail. She pinches off 14 pieces of clay, places them in 2 groups of 7, assigns birth goddesses to shape them, and after 10 months of gestation, the first humans emerge. The narrative treats this as a manufacturing process, not a mystical act. There are instructions, materials, a method. Ninhursag is not invoking divine power in the abstract, she is following a technique. This functional, almost technical portrayal of divine activity runs throughout the Mesopotamian texts. When the gods build a city, the tablets describe the measurement of the foundation, the carrying of bricks, the digging of canals. When they travel between locations, the texts sometimes specify distances and travel time. When they hold assemblies to make decisions, the structure mirrors the political assemblies of human city-states, debate, consensus building, voting. The family structure operates under similar logic. An is the supreme authority, but he does not micromanage. He delegates. He assigns territories to his children. Enlil receives authority over the Earth's surface and atmosphere. Enki receives the waters below and becomes the administrator of wisdom, of crafts, of the techniques by which things are made and maintained. Ninhursag receives the domain of birth and formation, of bringing new beings into existence. This division is not mythological symbolism, it is territorial allocation. The kind of arrangement a patriarch might make when dividing an inheritance among children: you take this region, you take that. You oversee this function, you manage that responsibility. And like many such divisions in royal families, it did not prevent conflict. The question remains, who was An? If we set aside the interpretive framework of mythology and look at the tablets as archival documents, what kind of figure is being described? A king, certainly. A progenitor of a bloodline, clearly. Someone with sufficient authority to assign territories and responsibilities to his offspring. Someone remote enough that his children, not he, administered the day-to-day governance of those territories. Someone whose position was secure enough that even when his grandson Marduk claimed supremacy in Babylon, the texts still acknowledged An as the ancestral patriarch, the origin point, the foundation of divine authority. The genealogical position of Anu is never disputed. Even when his active power fades, he remains the father. And the Anunnaki, whether 24 or 200, depending on how you count, are defined by their descent from him. They are the children of heaven and earth, the offspring of the primal separation. The bloodline that would, according to the tablets, rule Mesopotamia for thousands of years before passing that rule through marriage and decree to human kings. But first came the second generation, the brothers who divided the world, the three brothers who divided the world. The configuration appears again and again in Sumerian and Akkadian administrative texts, religious hymns, and mythological narratives, three names grouped together as if they form a complete unit: An, Enlil, Enki, or in later Babylonian versions, Anu, Enlil, Ea, the father and his two primary sons, the supreme god of heaven and his two vice-regents who actually govern creation. Across thousands of clay tablets spanning 2 millennia, this triad persists as the fundamental structure of divine authority. But the tablets describe more than shared authority. They describe a division, a formal allocation of cosmic territory agreed upon at some early point, and thereafter respected by all parties. The arrangement is so consistent across sources that it appears to have been established fact, not narrative invention, something the scribes recorded because it explained how the world was organised, not because it made for good storytelling. Enlil received the earth, not the ground itself, but the air above it, the space where weather happens, where breath moves, where commands travel from speaker to hearer. His name in Sumerian breaks down as Enlil, meaning Lord Air or Lord Wind. His domain was the atmosphere, that crucial middle layer between the unreachable heights of An and the deep waters of Enki. It was in this middle space that human beings lived. It was this space that determined whether crops grew or failed, whether storms destroyed cities or rain blessed fields. Enlil's territory was the immediate environment of mortal life. The ancient city of Nippur, located in what is now central Iraq, was recognized across all Mesopotamian cultures as Enlil's city. The temple there, called Ikur-Runta, was considered the holiest site in Sumer. Kings from distant cities, from Uruk, from Ur, from Lagash, from Akkad, travelled to Nippur to receive Enlil's blessing and legitimize their rule. A king might control territory through military force, but without Enlil's approval proclaimed at Nippur, his reign was considered illegitimate. This political function is documented extensively in royal inscriptions. King after king records their pilgrimage to Nippur, their offerings at Kur, their reception of divine favour. The pattern is so consistent it suggests something more than religious theatre. It suggests an actual authority recognised across competing city-states, an authority that transcended local political power. Enlil's position was not symbolic, it was jurisdictional. But Enlil was not gentle. The texts describe him as stern, quick to anger, absolute in his judgments. In the Sumerian flood narrative preserved on tablet CBS 10673, the story that would later influence the Atrahasis epic and eventually the biblical account of Noah, it is Enlil who decrees the destruction of humanity. The text states that human beings had become too numerous and too noisy. Their clamour disturbed the gods' rest. Enlil proposed a solution: annihilation, a flood that would wipe the earth clean and restore silence. The other gods agreed, except for Enki. Enki, the third member of the triad, had received the Apsu, the deep fresh water that flows beneath the earth, invisible and inexhaustible, the source of springs and rivers and wells. His Sumerian name, Enki, means Lord Earth, but his domain was not the surface. It was what lay below, the hidden waters, the underground ocean that, in Mesopotamian cosmology, pressed up from beneath, providing the moisture that made life possible in an arid land. Enki's city was Eridu, the southernmost of the major Sumerian settlements, located near the marshes where the Euphrates River spreads into channels and wetlands before reaching the Persian Gulf. Eridu was considered the oldest city, the first place where kingship descended from heaven to earth. Excavations at the site have uncovered temple foundations dating back to the Ubaid period, around 5000 BC, older than the earliest writing, older than the first identifiable Sumerian culture. Someone had been building temples at Eridu for a very long time. Enki's characterization in the tablets contrasts sharply with Enlil's. Where Enlil was stern and absolute, Enki was clever and compassionate. Where Enlil enforced decrees, Enki found loopholes. In the flood narrative, Enki did not openly defy Enlil's decision to destroy humanity. Such defiance might have triggered a divine civil war, but he circumvented it. He spoke to the wall of a reed house where a man named Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on the version, was sleeping. Enki addressed the wall, not the man, thereby technically obeying the prohibition against warning humans directly. The wall, of course, had ears. The man woke, overheard, and built a boat. This pattern, Enki acting as humanity's protector, finding ways to preserve human life, even when other gods decreed otherwise, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. In the Atrahasis epic, when the gods create humans to labour in their place, it is Enki who designs them. When Enlil later sends plague and drought to reduce human population, it is Enki who teaches people how to survive. When Enlil finally decrees the flood, it is Enki who ensures one family escapes. Why did Enki care? The texts provide a pragmatic answer. Humans were useful. They performed labour the gods no longer wished to do. They maintained temples, offered sacrifices, fed the divine households through ritual. Destroying them entirely would require the gods to resume the work themselves, an unappealing prospect. But the text also suggests something else, something less utilitarian. In multiple creation accounts, human beings are made with divine blood. A god is slaughtered, and his blood is mixed with clay. The implication is that humans carry within them a trace of the divine. They are not entirely separate. There is kinship, however distant. If Enki recognized that kinship, if he saw humans as more than tools, his repeated interventions make sense not as compassion in the abstract, but as obligation to distant relatives. The tablets describe intermarriage between divine and human lines. They describe gods taking human wives, goddesses taking human husbands, and the children of these unions becoming kings. If the bloodline mixed, then the distinction between god and human was not absolute. It was a matter of degree. But we are getting ahead of the genealogy. Before those mixed bloodlines emerge, we must understand the pure divine line. And the third figure in the administrative triad is not a brother, but a sister. Ninmah, Ninhursag, Nintud, the great queen, the lady of the mountain, the lady who gives birth. She is listed alongside An, Enlil, and Enki in the British Museum hymn recorded on tablet 17308. The grouping suggests equivalence, not 3 gods and a subsidiary goddess, but 4 co-equals, 4 children of An who together govern the cosmos. An presides from above, Enlil commands the middle air, Enki controls the waters below, and Ninhursag shapes living forms, presides over birth, regulates the biological processes by which the world replenishes itself. Her role in the creation of humanity is central. In the Atrahasis epic, it is Ninhursag under the name Mamai who performs the actual work. The assembly of gods has decided that humans must be created to relieve the lower gods from their labour. Enki proposes the method, mix clay with divine blood, but it is Ninhursag who implements it. She is the expert in fashioning living beings. The text describes her preparation, her instructions to the birth goddesses who will assist her, the precise gestures and incantations required. The process takes 10 months, the same gestation period as natural human birth. This detail is worth pausing over. If this were pure mythology, symbolic narrative about cosmic forces, why specify 10 months? Why describe the procedural steps? Why include Ninhursag's instructions about how to position the clay, how to pinch off the portions, how to wait for the appropriate time? The text reads like a technical manual because, perhaps it is one, a preserved record of how something was actually done, passed down and copied by scribes who no longer understood the full context but maintained the details faithfully because the tablet said this was how it happened. Ninhursag's relationship to Enlil and Enki is complicated in the myths by sexual and marital entanglements. In the tale of Enki and Ninhursag, preserved in Sumerian on tablets from Nippur, Enki seduces Ninhursag, who gives birth to a daughter. Enki then seduces the daughter, who gives birth to another daughter. The pattern repeats through several generations until Ninhursag intervenes by cursing Enki, causing parts of his body to become diseased. Eventually, she relents and heals him, and the two reconcile. The story is strange, disturbing, and resists easy interpretation. Is it about the generative power of water interacting with earth? Is it a mythologized explanation for plant growth and biological cycles? Or is it a garbled account of something that actually happened? A genealogical record where relationships have become confused, where a single union between Enki and Ninhursag has been split into multiple generations, where moral context has been lost, but the names and sequence have been preserved. Genealogical records from other cultures show similar confusion when transmitted orally across centuries before being written down. The biblical genealogies contain compressed generations, repeated names, and relationships that seem biologically impossible if read literally. Egyptian king lists include rulers whose reigns overlap impossibly, whose parentage is contradictory, whose very existence is disputed. Yet these texts preserve genuine historical information. You simply have to account for the distortion. What remains consistent is the triad, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, the 3 primary administrators beneath An, the 3 who made decisions affecting both gods and humans, the 3 whose territories, air, water and birth, encompassed all the processes necessary for life. When the god lists enumerate the Anunnaki, these 3 appear at the top, immediately below An himself. Their children would form the next generation, spreading across Mesopotamia, founding cities, claiming territories, establishing the divine dynasties that would eventually merge with human kingship. The division of the world among these three brothers and sister was not conflict, it was order, an imposed structure on the cosmos by delegating authority. Each child received their domain. Each was responsible for maintaining it. And for many generations, according to the tablets, the system functioned. The Anunnaki governed. Humanity laboured and worshipped. The cities grew. But succession creates tension. Authority divided among siblings invites competition among the next generation. And the children of Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag would not always cooperate as smoothly as their parents had. The bloodline would branch, and some branches would claim supremacy over others. The question of who held ultimate authority, who could decree the fate of gods and humans, would become contested. Before we follow those branches, we must understand the mother goddess more clearly, because Ninhursag's role extends beyond birth. She is present at nearly every key moment in the divine genealogy. She creates, she heals, she reconciles. She is the only figure who moves between the territories of all the male gods with apparent freedom. She is not subordinate to any of them, she is their equal. And her bloodline, the descendants traced through her, would carry an authority all their own. The mother goddess of many names. In the temple archives of ancient Lagash, a Sumerian city-state located in what is now southern Iraq, inscriptions record offerings made to a goddess called Bau. She was the city's patron deity, associated with healing, with dogs, and with the renewal of life. But Bau was also called Ninhursina in some texts, and Ninhursina was identified with Gula in Akkadian sources, and Gula was sometimes equated with Ninmah, and Ninmah was another name for Ninhursag. This chain of identifications, goddess A is goddess B, who is also goddess C, who may be goddess D, runs throughout Mesopotamian religious texts like a genealogical puzzle with pieces missing. Modern scholarship generally treats these as syncretism, the merging of distinct deities into composite figures as city-states were conquered and their pantheons absorbed. A goddess worshipped in Lagash and a goddess worshipped in Isin might be declared the same when one city came under the dominion of the other. Their myths merge, their epithets combine, their temples share resources. This explanation is logical and well supported. But it creates a problem when you try to read the god lists as genealogies, because the An School Ainum list carefully distinguishes between some of these figures while equating others. Bau is listed separately from Ninhursag as a distinct daughter of An, but Ninmah is explicitly identified with Ninhursag, two names for one goddess. The compilers made choices about which figures were genuinely identical and which were merely similar. They were not indiscriminately conflating deities, they were attempting to clarify relationships. What if the confusion of names is not theological syncretism, but genealogical compression? What if multiple women across several generations bore similar titles? Great Lady, Mother of the Mountain, Lady who gives birth, and later scribes, lacking complete records, conflated them into a single figure. Royal genealogies from other cultures show this pattern. A queen is referred to by her title rather than her personal name. Multiple queens share the same title. Later historians, reading the records, assume all references are to the same woman when in fact they describe grandmother, mother and daughter, 3 generations of women who held the same office. The Mesopotamian texts themselves hint at this complexity. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, the goddess gives birth to multiple daughters, each of whom then has her own children. Some of these daughters are named Ninsar, Ninkur, Uttu, but in other contexts, Ninsar is called a form of Ninhursag herself. The boundaries between individual and collective, between person and title, remain fluid. What is not fluid is Ninhursag's central role in creation. Across every version of the human creation narrative, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, she is present. She is the one with the expertise. In the Atrahasis epic, The gods are labouring, digging canals, carrying soil, maintaining the irrigation systems that make agriculture possible in Mesopotamia's arid environment. The labour is backbreaking. The lower gods, those assigned to physical work, complain. They are exhausted. They threaten rebellion. The great gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, convene to address the crisis. Enki proposes a solution: create a substitute labourer, a being designed specifically to do the work the gods no longer want to do. But he admits he does not know how to fashion such a being. He turns to Ninhursag. "You are the birth goddess," he says. "Create." The Atrahasis text records her response with remarkable specificity. She says she needs the right materials. She cannot create from nothing. She requires clay, the substance of earth, and divine blood. The blood will provide the intelligence, the life force, the element that separates a mere animated form from a being capable of thought and labour. The assembly agrees to provide it. They select a god called Wei'ilu, whose name means God who has intelligence. He is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay. Ninhursag shapes 14 figures, 7 male, 7 female. She assigns birth goddesses to each one. The gestation period is 10 months. When the time comes, the first humans emerge. They are called Lulu, a Sumerian term that can mean both human and mixed, a being that is part divine, part earthly. They are made to serve. The text states this explicitly. Humanity's purpose is to bear the labour of the gods. This narrative has been interpreted as a justification for social hierarchy, a mythological explanation for why some people labour while others rule. It reflects the class structure of ancient Mesopotamia, where the vast majority of the population worked the land to support a small priestly and royal elite. But the narrative also describes something else: genetic manipulation, the intentional design of a new type of being by mixing the essence of one species with the substance of another. Clay is lifeless, divine blood is not. Combine them and something new emerges, something that can work, think, reproduce, but is not fully divine. The implications are considerable if read literally. If the tablets are preserving an account of how humanity was created by an earlier, more advanced species, beings called Anunnaki, then what we are reading is a description of genetic engineering in pre-scientific language. The clay is the base biological material. The divine blood is the genetic template. Ninhursag is the bioengineer. The 10-month gestation in the wombs of birth goddesses is an artificial incubation process. The result is Homo sapiens, designed for a purpose. This reading is speculative. It requires assuming the tablets are not mythology, but degraded technical documentation. But the specificity of the descriptions, the procedural steps, the materials required, the time intervals, the roles of participants, does not read like poetry. It reads like instruction. Ninhursag's involvement in creation extends beyond humanity. In various texts, she is credited with shaping animals, with healing diseases, with establishing the biological order that allows life to perpetuate itself. She is not a passive mother archetype. She is active, technical, expert. When something needs to be made or fixed, the other gods turn to her. Her relationship with Enki is particularly close. They collaborate on projects, they argue, they reconcile. In one text, after Enki becomes ill from eating plants that belong to Ninhursag, she initially refuses to heal him. She is angry. But the other gods plead with her, and eventually she relents. She performs a healing ritual that involves creating 8 deities from the 8 parts of Enki's body that were diseased. Each of these deities is assigned a function, one for childbirth, one for plants, one for the horizon. The act of healing becomes an act of creation. This partnership between Enki, wisdom, water, crafts, and Ninhursag earth formation life suggests a division of labour in the administration of biological and material reality. Enki knows the techniques. Ninhursag implements them. Together, they shape living things. Their collaboration is essential. Neither can complete the work alone. But Ninhursag's authority extended beyond collaboration with male gods. She had her own cities, her own cult, her own priesthood. The city of Kesh, one of the oldest settlements in Sumer, was dedicated to her. So was the region of the Zagros Mountains, which formed the northeastern boundary of Mesopotamian civilization. She was called Lady of the Mountain because the mountains were her domain, the high places where the gods gathered, the boundary between the known world and the wilderness beyond. Her temples were places of healing. People came to be cured of illness, to pray for successful childbirth, to seek relief from suffering. The priests and priestesses of Ninhursag were trained in medical techniques. They used herbs, performed surgeries, set broken bones. Medicine and religion were not separate in Mesopotamia. Healing was a divine function, and Ninhursag's temples were where that function was exercised on behalf of humans. This practical medical aspect of her cult suggests something important about how the Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki. These were not abstract spiritual forces. They were beings with specific knowledge and specific abilities. They healed, they built, they managed resources, they taught techniques to their priests, who then applied those techniques on their behalf. The relationship was transactional, but also familial. Humans served the Anunnaki, but the Anunnaki also cared for humans, or at least certain Anunnaki did, in certain contexts, when it served the broader social order. Ninhursag's children, according to Anu and related god lists, included deities associated with crafts, with healing, with birth. But the lists are inconsistent about exactly who her children are and which gods she bore to which consort. In some traditions, she is the mother of Ninurta, a warrior god and son of Enlil. In others, Ninurta's mother is a different goddess. The confusion may reflect multiple marriages or multiple generations conflated into one, or simply gaps in the preserved records. What is clear is that her bloodline mattered. To claim descent from Ninhursag was to claim legitimacy in matters of health, birth and biological order. Her authority was not political in the way Enlil's was. It was biological. She governed the processes by which life continued. And in a world where infant mortality was high, where childbirth often killed the mother, where disease could wipe out entire cities, the goddess who controlled birth and healing held a power as essential as any military or administrative authority. But the next generation of the bloodline would shift the focus from creation to governance. The children of Enlil and Enki would take the structure established by their parents and extend it across the cities of Sumer, each claiming a city as their own, each establishing a cult, each demanding worship and sacrifice. The bloodline would spread, and with that spreading came the first signs of competition, the first disputes over territory and precedence, the first cracks in the unified authority that had characterized the earlier generations. The second generation of Anunnaki were not distant creators, they were local rulers, and their conflicts would shape the entire history of Mesopotamia. The second generation and the question of succession. In the city of located in what is now southern Iraq, near the Euphrates River, excavations have uncovered the remains of a massive ziggurat, a step temple platform rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain. The ziggurat was dedicated to Nana, the Sumerian moon god, who was also called Sin in Akkadian. The structure was not merely symbolic, it was functional architecture, designed to serve as the residence of the god, the place where he could descend from heaven and dwell among his people. The priests who maintained the temple understood their work as quite literal. They were housing a deity. Nana's position in the divine genealogy is clearly established across multiple sources. He is the son of Enlil, god of air and storm, and his consort Ninlil, a grain goddess. The circumstances of Nana's conception are preserved in a Sumerian myth that describes Enlil raping Ninlil, being punished by the other gods, and then marrying her. The narrative is disturbing, and scholars have offered various interpretations, mythologized agricultural cycles, cultural attitudes toward marriage and consent, political allegory. But the genealogical facts are consistent. Enlil and Ninlil produced Nanna. Nanna became the god of the moon. His domain was the night sky, the measurement of time through lunar cycles, the calendar by which religious festivals and agricultural work were organized. The moon was not merely a light in the darkness. It was a clock, a schedule, a way to structure the passage of days into comprehensible units. Nanna's authority, therefore, was temporal. He governed time. The city of Ur was his primary cult centre, but he was worshipped throughout Mesopotamia. The ziggurat at Ur still stands, partially reconstructed by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s based on the original foundations. Even in ruins, it dominates the landscape, a testament to the importance of Nanna's cult. Kings of Ur, across multiple dynasties spanning nearly 2,000 years, styled themselves as servants of Nanna. They built and rebuilt his temple. They endowed his priesthood. They recorded his blessings on their military campaigns. Nanna's wife was Ningal, a goddess whose name means great lady. Together they had children. And it is here, in the second generation of the bloodline, that the family tree begins to spread across the cities of Sumer, each major deity claiming a city as their seat of power. The most prominent of Nanna and Ningal's children were twins Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Twins are significant in many genealogical traditions. They suggest a special relationship, a balance, a symmetry. Utu and Inanna are frequently mentioned together in Sumerian texts, their bond emphasised to the point where some modern scholars have speculated about an incestuous dimension to their relationship, a speculation the texts neither confirm nor deny, but certainly do not discourage. Utu, called Shamash in Akkadian, governed the sun and by extension justice. The sun sees everything. It illuminates hidden deeds. It exposes wrongdoing. Shamash was therefore invoked in legal proceedings, in the swearing of oaths, in the pursuit of justice. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal documents in human history, depicts King Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash. The symbolism is explicit. Law comes from the sun god, from the one who sees all and judges fairly. Shamash's cult centre was the city of Sippar in northern Babylonia. Like his father Nanna at Ur, Shamash had a temple, a priesthood, and a city devoted to his worship. The temple was called E-Babar, the White House or the Shining House. The structure was rebuilt multiple times across the centuries, each new king proclaiming his piety by restoring the dwelling of the sun god. But it was Utu's twin sister, Inanna, who would become the most complex and widely worshipped deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Her Akkadian name was Ishtar, and under that name her cult spread far beyond Sumer, into Assyria, into the Levant, into Anatolia. She was the goddess of love, sex, fertility, and also of war, political power, and conquest. This combination, love and war, seems contradictory until you consider the common element: passion, desire, the overwhelming drive that compels action, whether toward a lover or an enemy. Inanna's cult centre was Uruk, one of the greatest cities of ancient Sumer and possibly the largest city in the world during the 4th millennium BC. Uruk was also the city of An, her great-grandfather. Her temple there, called Eanna, the House of Heaven, was one of the oldest religious structures in Mesopotamia, with foundations dating back to the Ubaid period. Over time, Inanna's cult at Uruk seems to have absorbed or overshadowed An's, and by the historical period it was Inanna, not An, who was the dominant deity of the city. Inanna's myths are numerous and well preserved. The most famous is her descent into the underworld, a journey to visit her sister Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead. The narrative describes Inanna passing through 7 gates, removing an item of clothing and divine power at each gate, until she arrives before her sister, naked and powerless. Ereshkigal kills her. Inanna's corpse hangs on a hook for 3 days. Eventually Enki intervenes, sending creatures to retrieve her. But the laws of the underworld require a substitute, someone must take Inanna's place. When she returns to the upper world, she finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, seemingly unconcerned by her absence. Enraged, she decrees that he will be her substitute. The story has been interpreted as seasonal myth, the death and rebirth of vegetation, the cycle of fertility, but it also reads as family drama, sibling rivalry between Inanna and Ereshkigal, marital betrayal between Inanna and Dumuzi, divine politics. The underworld is not an abstract realm, it is a territory governed by Ereshkigal, who has her own court, her own rules, her own jurisdiction. Inanna's journey is an act of political negotiation or conquest that goes badly. Ereshkigal herself is a fascinating figure in the genealogy. She is called Inanna's sister in the descent myth, which would make her a daughter of Nanna and Ningal, another child of the lunar line. But other texts present a different parentage, making her a daughter of Ananke, which would place her in the first generation of Anunnaki, not the second. The discrepancy is never resolved. Perhaps Ereshkigal is Inanna's half-sister, daughter of an earlier union. Perhaps the term sister is being used more loosely to indicate kinship, without specifying the exact relationship. Or perhaps the records have genuinely conflated two different figures. What is consistent is Ereshkigal's role. She rules the underworld. She is queen of the dead. After the death of the primordial goddess Tiamat in the Babylonian creation epic, Ereshkigal was assigned to the realm of the dead as its administrator. In some texts, she rules alone. In others, she is married to Nergal, a god associated with war and plague, who tricked or seduced his way into the underworld and became its king. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal describes their union as a kind of forced marriage. Nergal arrives in the underworld, overpowers Ereshkigal, and demands to share her throne. She submits, and they become co-rulers. The story is violent, uncomfortable, and resists sanitization. But it also describes the formation of a political alliance. Two territories under separate rulers become one kingdom under joint rule. If the underworld is a real jurisdiction, and Ereshkigal is its actual governor, then Nergal's arrival represents conquest or coalition, depending on your interpretation. This pattern, divine marriages that are also political alliances, runs throughout the genealogy of the Anunnaki. When a god from one city marries a goddess from another, the text treat it as significant. Territories are united, resources are shared, offspring inherit authority over both domains. The divine family tree is also a map of political power. Which brings us to the problem of Dumuzi. Dumuzi, called Tammuz in later traditions, is identified in texts variously as a shepherd, a king, and a god. The Sumerian king list, a chronological record of rulers that mixes mythological and historical kings into a single sequence, includes Dumuzi as one of the rulers of Uruk before the flood. The list assigns him a reign of 36,000 years, a number that, like the other pre-flood reigns, strains credibility unless we assume either symbolic time measurement or textual corruption. But Dumuzi is also a god with his own cult, worshipped as the god of shepherds and vegetation. His annual death and rebirth were commemorated in rituals across Mesopotamia, rituals that involved weeping, lamentation, and then celebration when he returned. The pattern mirrors agricultural cycles, but it also suggests a real historical figure whose death was so significant it became mythologized. Inanna's marriage to Dumuzi is well documented in Sumerian love poetry, texts that describe their courtship, their passion, their wedding. Inanna chooses Dumuzi over another suitor, a farmer god named Enkimdu. The choice of shepherd over farmer may reflect political tensions between nomadic and settled populations in early Sumer, but it also establishes Dumuzi as Inanna's consort, which, given Inanna's status as granddaughter of Enlil and great-granddaughter of Anu, places Dumuzi within the extended Anunnaki bloodline through marriage. If Dumuzi was human or partially human, His marriage to Inanna represents the first significant mixing of divine and mortal lines, the beginning of what would become a long pattern of intermarriage between Anunnaki and the human raw lines they established. If Dumuzi was fully divine, then the tragedy of his death and descent to the underworld represents a loss within the Anunnaki bloodline itself, a god who should have been immortal but wasn't. The question of succession becomes acute in this generation. Who inherits authority? Nanna inherits from Enlil. Utu and Inanna inherit from Nanna. But Inanna's power rivals or exceeds that of her father and brother. By the historical period, she is the more actively worshipped deity. Her temples are richer, her festivals are more elaborate, her mythology is more developed. Did she claim authority that would ordinarily have passed to her twin brother Utu, or was she granted separate authority as part of the original allocation? The texts do not explain the mechanism of succession because they seem to assume the reader already knows. Power is inherited, but it is also claimed. A god who builds a city, who gathers worshippers, who performs deeds, acquires authority. Inanna's descent to the underworld, her marriage to Dumuzi, her military campaigns described in hymns that portray her as a fierce warrior, her sexual exploits, all of these are acts of power accumulation. She does not wait to be given authority, she takes it. And this pattern, active claiming of authority rather than passive inheritance, will characterize the later generations as well. The third generation of Anunnaki will see even more aggressive competition, particularly as new cities rise and their patron deities demand recognition. The bloodline will continue to spread, but the unity of the earlier generations, the clear division of territories under Anu's supreme authority, will begin to fracture. Before we trace those fractures, however, we must examine the twins more closely. Utu and Inanna, the Sun and Venus. Brother and sister, inseparable in the texts, their relationship charged with an intensity that goes beyond ordinary sibling bonds. Because there is something about twins in the Anunnaki genealogy, something the tablets emphasize repeatedly, that suggests they were not accidents of birth, but intentional pairings. And the purpose of those pairings may reveal something about how the bloodline was managed, how authority was transferred, and what it meant to be born Anunnaki. The twins of light. In the night sky above ancient Sumer, two celestial bodies dominated the sun by day, and Venus, the morning and evening star, which appeared brighter than any other object except the sun and moon. The Sumerians observed these patterns with precision. They tracked Venus's movements, recorded her cycles, noted when she rose before the sun and when she appeared after sunset. She was to them a being of dual nature, appearing in two places, embodying two roles, a single entity that manifested in opposite ways, and in their genealogical records they assigned this dual star to a pair of twins, Utu, the sun, and Inanna, Venus, brother and sister, born together, ruling the two brightest lights in the sky. The astronomical correspondence is too precise to be accidental. Shamash Uaitilian was not merely associated with the sun, he was the sun. His temple was oriented to catch the first rays of dawn. His symbols, the solar disk, rays of light extending outward, appear on countless seals, inscriptions, and boundary stones throughout Mesopotamian history. When the sun rose, Shamash was said to emerge from the mountains in the east, travelling across the sky in his chariot, observing all that happened below, before descending into the mountains of the west at day's end. Inanna was Venus, not symbolically, literally. The planet Venus was called the Star of Ishtar. Her movements were her movements. When Venus disappeared from the sky for periods, as it does during inferior conjunction with the sun, Inanna was said to have descended to the underworld. When Venus reappeared, Inanna had returned. The astronomical phenomenon and the mythological narrative were understood as different perspectives on the same events. This literalism, gods are celestial bodies, celestial movements are divine actions, runs throughout Mesopotamian astronomical texts, The priests maintained detailed observational records. They predicted eclipses, planetary positions, and the appearance of comets. These predictions were not abstract science. They were intelligence about the movements of the gods. If Mars approached a certain constellation, it meant Nergal was travelling to that region of the heavens. If Jupiter appeared unusually bright, it signalled Marduk's increased power and favour. From this perspective, the genealogy of the Anunnaki is also an astronomical map. Anu is the pole of the heavens, the fixed point around which all else rotates. Enlil is the atmosphere, the region between Earth and stars. Nana is the moon, Utu is the sun, Inanna is Venus. Each generation corresponds to a different layer of the cosmos, a different category of celestial object, but the texts do not treat these identifications as purely metaphorical. When Inanna descends to the underworld, the planet Venus literally disappears from the sky. The narrative and the observation align. The question, then, is not whether the Sumerians were describing celestial mechanics, they clearly were, but whether they understood these celestial bodies as distant objects or as the actual locations and manifestations of the gods themselves. If the latter, then the family tree of the Anunnaki is describing a civilization with the capability to inhabit different celestial environments. Anu on the orbital level beyond the planets, Enlil in the atmospheric sphere, Nana on the moon, Utu as a solar presence, Inanna associated with Venus, not living on the planet necessarily, but connected to it, moving in synchronization with it. This reading transforms mythology into a kind of astronomical genealogy, a record of where different branches of the family were located within the solar system. This interpretation is speculative and not supported by mainstream scholarship, which treats the celestial correspondences as metaphor and religious symbolism. But the precision of the correlations is worth noting. The Sumerians did not assign gods to planets randomly. The correspondences are consistent across thousands of years. Mars is always Nergal, Jupiter is always Marduk, Venus is always Inanna, Saturn is Ninurta, Mercury is Nabu. These identifications were maintained even as political and theological systems changed, even as one dynasty replaced another. The celestial map of divine presence remained stable. Utu's role as the sun god extends beyond light. He is explicitly called the god of justice. The solar disk appears above depictions of legal proceedings. Oaths are sworn in Shamash's name. To lie under the sun is to lie before Shamash, who sees all and will punish perjury. This association between sunlight and justice makes practical sense. Crimes are easier to commit in darkness, and daylight exposes them, but it also suggests a surveillance function. Shamash observes, he records, he judges. His cult centre at Sippar maintained extensive archives. Legal disputes were brought to the temple for resolution. Contracts were witnessed by Shamash's priests. Property boundaries were marked with stones dedicated to Shamash, the markers inscribed with curses against anyone who would move them. The entire legal infrastructure of Babylonia was, in a sense, overseen by the sun god. Law was his domain because observation was his function. Inanna's role is more volatile. She is the goddess of love, sexual desire, romantic passion, fertility, but she is also the goddess of war, conquest, destruction, the chaos of battle. Hymns describe her as both seductive and terrifying. She is the Lady of Heaven, adorned in lapis lazuli and gold, radiating beauty. She is also the one who dances on corpses, who delights in the blood of her enemies, who tears down city walls and scatters armies. This combination, love and war, has fascinated interpreters for centuries. Some see it as the union of fertility and death, the cycle of life. Others see it as reflecting the planet Venus's dual appearance, the morning and evening star. Still others suggest it represents the political power of female rulers in early Sumer, women who commanded both household and army. But the texts themselves suggest something simpler. Inanna is a goddess of intensity. Whether that intensity expresses itself as love or war depends on the context, but the underlying force is the same: overwhelming, consuming, irresistible. She does not do anything by halves. When she loves, it is total. When she destroys, it is absolute. Her relationship with her brother Utu is unusually close. In multiple myths, Utu aids Inanna in her schemes. When she wants to visit the underworld, Utu warns her of the danger, but does not stop her. When she is trapped there, Utu is one of the gods Enki sends messengers to, though Utu refuses to help rescue her. When she returns and seeks vengeance on Dumuzi, Utu again tries to intervene, but ultimately cannot prevent the outcome. Their interactions suggest a sibling bond that is intimate, protective, and strained. Utu acts as the more cautious, rational counterpart to Inanna's impulsive, passionate nature. The texts occasionally hint at something more. Descriptions of the twins are sometimes charged with language that, in other contexts, would imply romantic or sexual attraction. They are beautiful together. They shine together. They are two aspects of a single light. Modern scholarship generally interprets this as poetic imagery reflecting their astronomical connection. Sun and Venus rise together, set together, dominate the sky together. But ancient royal families did practice sibling marriage to preserve bloodlines. Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Inca emperors did the same. If the Anunnaki practiced similar endogamy, Utu and Inanna's closeness might reflect more than sibling affection. The texts do not confirm this explicitly, but they do not deny it either, and the deliberate pairing of twins throughout the genealogy, Lamu and Lahamu, Anshar and Kishar, Utu and Inanna, suggests that twin births carried special significance. Were they accidents of biology, or were they intentional? Did the Anunnaki have control over reproduction in ways that allowed them to produce twin heirs? And if so, why twins? What advantage did pairing provide? One possible answer lies in governance. Two rulers sharing power creates a check and balance. One observes, the other acts. One represents law and order, the other represents passion and transformation. Together, they cover a wider range of functions than either could alone. The paired rule of twins might have been a deliberate administrative strategy, a way to ensure that authority was not concentrated in a single individual, but distributed across complementary personalities. If this was the pattern, it did not continue uniformly. Later generations do not emphasize twin births as strongly, but the model was established. The Sun and Venus, justice and war, observation and action, male and female, two aspects of divine authority, separated in function but unified in origin. Inanna's descendants would include kings, human kings who claimed her as their divine ancestor. The rulers of Uruk, where her cult was centered, traced their legitimacy through her. If a king could claim descent from Inanna, either through direct bloodline or through a marriage alliance, his rule was considered divinely sanctioned. And because Inanna's authority was already immense, greater in practice than her father Nana or her uncle Enki, claiming descent from her was claiming descent from one of the most powerful figures in the Anunnaki hierarchy. But before we trace those human connections, we must confront the figure who married Inanna, Dumuzi, the shepherd god, the dying god, the king of Uruk, because Dumuzi's position in the genealogy is ambiguous in a way that matters. If he was fully divine, then his death and resurrection are cosmic events. A god who dies is an ontological impossibility unless something has gone wrong. If he was fully human, then his marriage to Inanna represents the first major bridge between the divine and human bloodlines. And if he was something in between, part Anunnaki, part human, then he is evidence that the bloodlines were already mixing by the second generation. The tablets do not clarify which of these is true. They present Dumuzi as shepherd, as king, as husband of Inanna, as sacrifice, as the one who descends to the underworld in Inanna's place. They record his sister Geshtin Inanna's grief, her agreement to spend half the year in the underworld so Dumuzi can return for the other half. They document the rituals of lamentation performed each year when Dumuzi dies, and the celebrations when he returns. What they do not do is explain what Dumuzi was, and that ambiguity may be the point, because if the bloodline was already mixing, if the boundaries between Anunnaki and human were already porous, then the genealogical tree is not a simple branching structure. It is a web, with threads connecting across generations, across species categories, across the supposed divide between gods and mortals. The next chapter in the family tree brings us into even stranger territory, the underworld branch, the descendants of Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead. Because if the Anunnaki ruled the heavens, the earth and the waters, someone also had to govern the realm below. And that governance over death, over the spirits of the dead, over the boundary between life and what comes after, was assigned to a goddess who may have been Inanna's sister or Inanna's aunt, or someone else entirely. The records conflict, but the role is clear. Ereshkigal ruled below, and her marriage to Nergal created a dynasty of the underworld, a branch of the family tree that extended into darkness, the underworld branch. The Mesopotamian underworld was not a place of punishment or reward. It was not heaven or hell. It was simply the place where the dead went, all of them, regardless of virtue or crime, king and slave alike. The Sumerian name for this realm was Kur, which can also mean mountain or foreign land. The Akkadians called it Irkalla. It was described as a dark, dusty place beneath the earth, where the dead existed as shadows, drinking muddy water and eating dust. They did not suffer eternal torment, but neither did they experience joy. They simply were in a kind of perpetual twilight, separated from the world of the living by 7 gates. This realm had a queen, Ereshkigal, whose name means Lady of the Great Place, or Queen of the Great Below. Her authority was absolute within her domain. No god, not even Anu or Enlil, could countermand her decrees once a being had entered her kingdom. The dead belonged to her, and the living did not visit without consequence. Ereshkigal's position in the divine genealogy is inconsistent across sources, as noted earlier. In some texts, she is the sister of Inanna, which would make her a daughter of Nanna, Muld and Ningal, placing her in the 2nd generation of the Anunnaki bloodline, the generation of grandchildren of Anu. In other texts, particularly older Sumerian sources, she is called a daughter of Anu and Ki directly, which would make her part of the 1st generation, a sibling to Enlil and Enki, and therefore an aunt to Inanna rather than a sister. The inconsistency may reflect different traditions from different cities, or it may be that sister is being used in a broader sense to mean female relative, or it may be that there were 2 figures named Ereshkigal, one earlier and one later, whose records have been merged. The scholarly consensus is that the variation reflects the evolution of mythology over time, but no definitive answer has emerged. What is consistent is her role and her isolation. Ereshkigal did not choose to rule the underworld. According to some traditions, she was assigned there or banished there after the death of the primordial goddess Tiamat and the reorganization of the cosmos under Marduk in the Babylonian version, or under the collective authority of the elder Anunnaki in earlier Sumerian versions. She rules alone for an unspecified period, administering the dead, maintaining the boundary between life and death, ensuring that no one leaves her realm without permission. Her loneliness is a recurring theme. The underworld is a place of shadows, and even a queen is isolated among shadows. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal addresses this directly. The story exists in multiple versions, the most complete preserved on tablets from the site of Tel El Amarna in Egypt, where diplomatic correspondence between Mesopotamian and Egyptian courts included mythological texts as cultural exchange. The tale begins with a banquet in heaven. The gods gather, but Ereshkigal cannot attend because she cannot leave the underworld. If she did, the dead would escape. She sends her vizier Namtar to receive her portion of the feast. When Namtar arrives, all the gods rise in respect, except one. Nergal, the god of war and plague, remains seated. This is an insult. Namtar reports the offence to Ereshkigal, and she demands that Nergal be sent to the underworld to answer for his disrespect. Nergal descends through the 7 gates. At each gate, he is stripped of his divine regalia, his crown, his weapons, his symbols of power. By the time he reaches Ereshkigal's throne, he is vulnerable. But instead of accepting punishment, he seizes her, drags her from her throne, and threatens to kill her unless she agrees to share her kingdom with him. Ereshkigal, rather than resisting further, submits or negotiates. The text is ambiguous. They become lovers. They marry. Nergal becomes king of the underworld alongside Ereshkigal as queen. The story is troubling. It describes what appears to be sexual violence, coercion, a forced marriage. Some interpreters argue that Ereshkigal's submission is pragmatic. She recognizes that resistance is futile and chooses to make Nergal her ally rather than her enemy. Others suggest the narrative is mythologizing a political merger, the unification of 2 separate underworld cults under joint leadership. Still others read it as a conquest narrative, the subjugation of an older goddess by a newer, more aggressive god as religious power shifted during the Akkadian and Babylonian periods. But the text itself suggests something else in its conclusion. After their union, Nergal attempts to return to the upper world. Ereshkigal is distraught. She sends a message to the gods demanding his return, threatening chaos if he does not come back. Nergal, for reasons the text does not fully explain, chooses to return. He descends again through the 7 gates and rejoins Ereshkigal. This time, the text says, they embrace. They kiss. They lie together, not in violence, but in passion. The forced beginning has transformed into something else. Partnership, perhaps, or at least mutual accommodation. Nergal's identity is worth examining. He is associated with war, plague, fever, and the destructive heat of summer. His cult centre was the city of Kutha in northern Babylonia, and his temple there, called E-Meslam, was considered one of the entrances to the underworld. Nergal was not a benevolent deity. He was feared. Prayers to Nergal were often protective, asking him not to act, to withhold his plague, to spare the petitioner from his wrath. His genealogy places him as a son of Enlil, or in some sources, a son of Enki, making him part of the 2nd or 3rd generation of Anunnaki, depending on the tradition. His marriage to Ereshkigal thus represents either a union between aunt and nephew if Ereshkigal is 1st generation, or between cousins if she is 2nd generation. Either way, the marriage keeps authority within the extended family. The underworld remains under Anunnaki control. But the underworld is also a place of exile. Ereshkigal's isolation, Nergal's reluctant descent, the characterization of Kur as dark and dusty and undesirable, all of this suggests that ruling the underworld was not a privilege, but a burden. It was necessary work, essential to the cosmic order, but not enviable. Someone had to govern the dead. Someone had to maintain the boundary. Ereshkigal was assigned that task, or chose it, or was trapped in it. The sources do not agree. Her relationship with her sister, Inanna, is fraught. The myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld portrays Ereshkigal as hostile, even murderous. When Inanna arrives at the gates of the underworld, ostensibly to attend the funeral of Gugalana, Ereshkigal's first husband, according to some sources killed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ereshkigal is immediately suspicious. Why would the Queen of Heaven visit the Queen of the Underworld? What does she want? Inanna passes through the 7 gates, and at each gate she is stripped of one item: her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her jewellery, her robe. By the time she reaches the throne room, she is naked and powerless. Ereshkigal pronounces judgment. Inanna is killed. Her corpse is hung on a hook. For 3 days she remains dead. The text does not explain why Ereshkigal kills her. Jealousy? A perceived threat? simply because the underworld's law requires that no living being can pass through and return unchanged? The ambiguity has generated endless interpretation, but the act itself is clear. Ereshkigal exercises her authority absolutely. Even Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, cannot override the Queen of the Underworld within her own domain. Inanna's eventual resurrection involves negotiation. Enki, the god of wisdom, creates two genderless beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails. They descend to the underworld, sympathize with Ereshkigal's pain. She is in labour, the text says, giving birth, though to what or whom is not specified, and in return Ereshkigal releases Inanna's corpse. The beings revive Inanna with the food and water of life, but the law of the underworld remains. If Inanna leaves, someone must take her place. This law, the law of substitution, is critical. The underworld must maintain balance, a life for a life. If one departs, another must stay. It is not symbolic, it is procedural. The underworld operates under strict rules, and Ereshkigal enforces them without exception. When Inanna returns to the upper world, she finds Dumuzi, her husband, sitting on her throne instead of mourning her. Enraged, she designates him as her substitute. Dumuzi flees, but the demons of the underworld pursue him. Eventually, he is captured and dragged below. His sister Geshtinanna offers to share his sentence, 6 months in the underworld, 6 months in the world above. Ereshkigal accepts the arrangement, and so the cycle is established. Dumuzi dies each year, descends to the underworld, and returns 6 months later. The seasons are tied to his presence or absence. This myth has been interpreted as an agricultural allegory, the death of vegetation in the dry season, its return with the rains. But it also describes a literal event in the framework of the genealogy. Dumuzi, consort of Inanna, becomes subject to Ereshkigal's authority. He enters the underworld branch of the family tree, not by birth, but by judicial decree. Ereshkigal's children are rarely mentioned in the surviving texts, but the god lists do include offspring. One text mentions a son named Ninazu, a god of healing and the underworld. Another mentions a daughter, though her name varies across sources. These children, born in the underworld, represent a branch of the Anunnaki bloodline that exists in separation from the rest. They do not rule cities in Sumer. They do not receive temples among the living. Their domain is below. And yet, Ereshkigal's authority is acknowledged even by the most powerful gods. When the hero Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, travels to the underworld to consult the spirit of his friend Enkidu, he must do so through negotiation and ritual. He cannot simply enter. Even Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, king of Uruk, cannot override Ereshkigal's jurisdiction. The underworld branch of the family tree, then, represents a separate but parallel line of authority. The Anunnaki govern above, the heavens, the earth, the waters, but they also govern below, the realm of the dead, the spirits, the boundary between being and non-being. The bloodline extends into that darkness, and the rulers of that darkness, Ereshkigal and Nergal, are as much Anunnaki as Enlil or Enki or Inanna. The question is whether this division, upper world and underworld, was always separate, or whether it represents a schism. Did the family tree branch intentionally, with some descendants assigned to govern the dead while others govern the living? Or was Ereshkigal's rule in the underworld a form of exile, a removal from the primary line of succession, a banishment that became permanent? The texts do not say, but the isolation, the loneliness, the reluctance of even Nergal to remain in the underworld, all of this suggests that ruling the dead was not a choice freely made. It was a necessity. Someone had to do it. Ereshkigal was assigned the task, or claimed it, or was trapped in it, and so a branch of the family tree grew in darkness, governing a realm that even the other gods preferred not to enter. But while Ereshkigal ruled below, another branch of the family was rising to prominence above, a branch that would in time claim supremacy over all others. The line of Marduk, son of Enki, patron god of Babylon. His rise to power would require a revision of the entire genealogy, a political rewriting of the family tree to place him at its head. And that revision, recorded in the 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish, would reshape Mesopotamian religion for the rest of its history. Marduk's rise and the Babylon revision. In 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the remains of the ancient city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, located in what is now northern Iraq. Among the ruins of the palace of King Ashurbanipal, Layard discovered thousands of clay tablets, an entire royal library preserved beneath the collapsed roof of the building. These tablets included administrative records, royal correspondence, medical texts, astronomical observations, and literary works. Among them were 7 tablets that, when translated, revealed the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish tells the story of creation, but it is also a political document. Its central narrative is the rise of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, from a junior deity to the supreme king of all gods. The epic describes how Marduk defeated the primordial goddess Tiamat, split her body to create the heavens and the earth, established the cosmic order, and was acclaimed by the assembly of gods as their ruler. In return for his victory, Marduk demanded and received absolute authority. The gods swore oaths of loyalty. They built him a temple in Babylon. They decreed that his word would be law. This narrative is not ancient. It is not Sumerian. It was composed during the Babylonian period, likely during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar the 12th century, or possibly earlier during the Old Babylonian period, when Babylon first rose to regional dominance under King Hammurabi, 18th century. The Enuma Elish was recited publicly during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration, as part of the ritual that reaffirmed Marduk's supremacy and, by extension, Babylon's political authority. The epic revises the genealogy in a specific way. It inserts new generations at the beginning, pushing the earlier gods back in time. Apsu and Tiamat become the primordial parents. Lamu and Lahamu are their children. Anshar and Kishar are the children of Lamu and Lahamu. Anu is the child of Anshar and Kishar. This extends the family tree backward, creating more ancestral generations. But the critical move is what the epic does with Marduk himself. Marduk is identified as the son of Ea Kenki and Damkina, a goddess associated with the earth and the waters. This makes Marduk the grandson of Anu, part of the 2nd generation of active deities, the same generation as Nana, Utu, and Inanna. But unlike those deities who govern specific domains or cities, Marduk claims universal authority. He defeats Tiamat, not for a single city, but for all the gods. He creates the cosmos not as one god among many, but as the supreme architect. His victory rewrites the power structure. The older Sumerian texts do not give Marduk this role. In those texts, creation is a collaborative act involving An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag. Tiamat is defeated by Ea Enki, not by Marduk. The cosmic order is established by the collective authority of the elder gods, not by a single heroic figure. Marduk appears in Sumerian texts, but as a minor god of agriculture, and later as the patron of Babylon, important locally, but not supreme. The Enuma Elish changes this. It takes the older creation narratives, inserts Marduk as the central actor, and elevates him above his father Enki and his great-grandfather Anu. The text explicitly describes a transfer of authority. After Marduk's victory, the gods proclaim, "He who vanquished Tiamat shall have dominion over us." They grant him 50 names, each representing a different aspect of divine power. One of these names is Enlil of the gods, effectively claiming for Marduk the authority that Enlil had previously held. This is not mythology, this is political theology. When Babylon became the dominant city in Mesopotamia, its priesthood needed to justify that dominance in religious terms. The solution was to revise the mythology, to write a new creation epic that placed Babylon's god at the centre of the cosmos. The Enuma Elish is Babylonian propaganda, sophisticated and effective, embedding political claims within a cosmological framework. But here is the critical point. The revision did not replace the older genealogy, it supplemented it. The Enuma Elish acknowledges Anu as Marduk's great-grandfather. It acknowledges Enlil's prior authority. It does not erase the earlier gods. It recontextualizes them. They become part of a longer history, a history that culminates in Marduk's supremacy. The bloodline is extended, not overwritten. This matters for our investigation because it shows how the genealogical records were maintained and modified across time. The scribes who compiled the god lists, who copied the Anishkel-Anim tablet series, who preserved the Sumerian creation myths alongside the Babylonian ones, they did not treat these as contradictory fictions that could be discarded at will. They treated them as different versions of the same history, versions that needed to be preserved even when they conflicted. If the Anunnaki family tree is a historical genealogy rather than mythology, then what we are seeing in the Enuma Elish is a dynastic revision, a later generation claiming authority by rewriting the records to emphasize their own lineage. This is not unusual in royal genealogies. Roman emperors invented divine ancestors. Chinese emperors trace their lineage to mythical sage kings. European monarchs claim descent from biblical patriarchs. The manipulation of genealogy to justify power is a human universal. If the Anunnaki were real, we would expect their descendants to do the same. Marduk's son Nabu also rises to prominence during the Babylonian period. Nabu is the god of writing, wisdom, and scribal arts. His name means to proclaim or to name. He is depicted holding a stylus, the tool used to write cuneiform on clay tablets. His temple, called Izida, was located in the city of Borsippa, near Babylon. Nabu's cult was enormously popular. He was invoked by scribes, scholars, and kings who wanted wisdom and eloquence. Nabu's elevation alongside his father Marduk represents the consolidation of a new divine dynasty centered on Babylon. Marduk rules the cosmos. Nabu administers knowledge and communication. Together, they form a father-son duo that mirrors the earlier pairing of Anu and Enlil, but with authority centralized in Babylon rather than distributed across multiple cities. The Assyrians, northern rivals of Babylon, did not accept Marduk's supremacy. In Assyrian religious texts, the god Ashur, patron of the Assyrian capital, is given the supreme role. Some Assyrian versions of the Enuma Elish replace Marduk's name with Ashur's, retelling the same story but assigning the victory to a different god. This shows how malleable the narratives were, how they could be adapted to serve the political needs of different cities and dynasties. But beneath these political revisions, the underlying genealogical structure remains consistent. Ashur is not invented from nothing. He is integrated into the existing family tree, sometimes as a son of Enlil, sometimes as equivalent to Enlil, sometimes as a separate but related lineage. The family tree bends, but it does not break. New branches are added, older branches are recontextualized. But the core structure, descent from Anu, division among his children, the spreading of the bloodline across cities and territories, persists. What does this tell us? If these texts are mythology, the persistence of the genealogical framework is unremarkable. Myths have narrative structures that repeat. But if these texts are distorted historical records, the persistence is significant. It means the genealogy itself was considered factual, even when the stories surrounding it were revised. You could change who did what, who was supreme when, which city held power, but you could not change the bloodline. Marduk could claim supremacy, but he had to claim it as the son of Enki, grandson of Anu. He could not invent a new lineage. He had to work within the existing structure. The Enuma Elish also introduces a creation of humanity that differs slightly from earlier accounts. In the Babylonian version, after Marduk defeats Tiamat and establishes the cosmic order, the gods complain that they still have to labour, maintaining the rivers, building cities, tending the fields. Marduk proposes creating humans to do the work. Irki suggests using the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's consort and general, who led her army against the gods. Kingu is executed. His blood is mixed with clay. Humanity is fashioned. And the purpose is explicit. Let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe. This is the same basic narrative as the Atrahasis epic, humans created from divine blood and clay to serve as labourers, but now Marduk is credited with the initiative, and Kingu's blood replaces the unnamed god of the earlier version. The genealogical implication is subtle but important. Humans carry the blood of Kingu, a divine being who rebelled against the Anunnaki and lost. Humanity is made from the essence of a defeated enemy, not from the bloodline of the ruling gods. This distances humans genealogically from the Anunnaki, emphasizing their subordinate status. But this creates a tension with other texts that describe intermarriage between gods and humans, gods taking human lovers, demigod offspring who become kings. If humans are made from rebellious divine blood, are they entirely separate from the Anunnaki, or do they carry a diluted version of the same essence? The texts do not resolve this, but the ambiguity allows for the possibility that the boundary between Anunnaki and human is permeable, that the bloodlines can and do mix, that some humans carry more of the divine essence than others. Marduk's rise, then, represents not just a shift in political power, but a shift in how the family tree is understood. The earlier Sumerian model was horizontal, multiple cities, multiple gods, each with their own territory and authority, all acknowledging Anu as the distant patriarch, but governing independently. The Babylonian model is vertical, a single supreme god at the top, with all other gods subordinate, and humanity at the bottom, serving the divine order. But the bloodline remains. Marduk does not erase his ancestors. He claims to fulfill their will. He positions himself as the rightful heir, the one who completed what earlier generations began. And this claim requires acknowledging the genealogy, tracing his authority back through Enki, through Anu, through the primordial generations, all the way to the beginning. The family tree bends toward Babylon, but its roots remain in Sumer. And as we trace those roots further, as we move from the second generation to the third and beyond, we will see the bloodline spread across Mesopotamia, each city claiming its own divine patron, each patron claiming descent from Anu. The Anunnaki are no longer a small group of siblings dividing the world. They are an extended family, a dynasty, a network of bloodlines that govern every major city in Mesopotamia. And at some point, that network intersects with human kingship. The gods take human lovers. The kings claim divine ancestry. The boundary between Anunnaki and human dissolves into a spectrum, a gradation, a question of degree rather than kind. But before we reach that intersection, we must understand who the Anunnaki were collectively, because the term Anunnaki does not refer to all gods. It refers to a specific group, a specific rank, a specific category within the divine hierarchy. And there is another group, the Igigi, who are mentioned alongside them, sometimes as subordinates, sometimes as a separate class. The god lists organise these categories with bureaucratic precision, and that organisation may reveal something about how the bloodline was structured, how authority was distributed, and what it meant to be called Anunnaki. The Anunnaki is a collective. The term Anunnaki appears hundreds of times across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, spanning nearly 3,000 years. It is written in cuneiform as Anunnaki, or Anunnakine in Sumerian, translated into Akkadian as Anunnaku or Anunnaki. The term is grammatically plural. It does not refer to a single individual, but to a group. The literal meaning is those of royal blood, or those descended from An and Anulul, with key indicating of the earth, or those who came to earth. But not all gods are called Anunnaki. The god lists distinguish between different ranks and categories of divine beings. Some are explicitly labelled Anunnaki. Others are called E.g., a separate group, sometimes described as younger gods, sometimes as gods who labour, sometimes as gods of heaven, in contrast to the Anunnaki of earth and underworld. The distinction is not always clear, and texts from different periods use the terms in different ways, but the underlying implication is that God is a category with internal hierarchies. In early Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BC, the term Anunna without the key refers to the great gods, the most powerful deities, those who make decisions, who decree fates, who govern the cosmos. These are the children and grandchildren of An. They are the ones who sit in divine assembly, who judge disputes, who allocate resources and territories. In some contexts, the Anunna seems synonymous with the gods who matter, excluding minor deities, local spirits, and the vast number of lesser divine beings that populate Mesopotamian religious texts. But by the Akkadian period, 3rd millennium, the term Anunnaki begins to take on more specific connotations. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki are associated with the underworld. When the flood comes, the Anunnaki are terrified and retreat to the highest heavens. When Enkidu dies, he descends to the House of Dust, where the Anunnaki dwell in darkness. In the Descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki are described as sitting in judgment in Ereshkigal's throne room. This association, Anunnaki with the underworld, is not universal, but it is persistent enough in later texts to suggest a shift in meaning. Where Anunna in early Sumerian sources referred to the great gods generally, Anunnaki in later Akkadian and Babylonian sources often refers specifically to underworld gods, or to the collective of gods who judge the dead, or to a category of divine beings who are powerful but subordinate to the supreme gods of heaven. The god list Anscoanum attempts to organise this complexity. The first 4 tablets of the list are devoted to the major gods and their courts: Anu, Enlil, Ninhursag, Enki, Sin, Shamash, Adad, Ishtaran, Nergal, and others. These are the Anunnaki proper, the great gods who govern specific domains, who have major cult centres, who receive royal offerings. The list includes their spouses, their children, their attendants, their associated deities. It is a genealogical map, a governmental org chart, and a theological encyclopedia all at once. But later tablets in the Anunnaki Anum series include hundreds of additional divine names, minor gods, local deities, protective spirits, personifications of abstract concepts. Some of these are clearly subordinate to the major gods, listed as servants or attendants. Others are obscure figures whose function is unclear. Many appear nowhere else in the surviving literature. The compilers of the list were attempting to document the entire divine bureaucracy, not just the prominent members. The ORAC database, maintained by the University of Pennsylvania, describes the Anunna Anunnaki as a group of gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, and notes that later on it is sometimes used to describe the underworld gods as opposed to the gods of heaven and earth. The database also notes that the term can be used interchangeably with the great gods in some contexts, while in others it refers to a specific subset of deities distinct from the Igigi. The Igigi are even more poorly defined. In some texts, they are described as the younger gods who labour, digging canals, carrying loads, maintaining the infrastructure of the cosmos. In the Atrahasis epic, it is the Igigi who complain about their labour and threaten rebellion, leading to the creation of humans to replace them. But in other texts, the Igigi are gods of heaven, while the Anunnaki are gods of earth and underworld. And in still other contexts, the terms seem interchangeable, used simply to mean the gods without a clear distinction. The confusion may reflect changes in religious organisation over time. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved, as cities rose and fell, as dynasties changed and cults merged, the terminology shifted. What Anunnaki meant in 2500 Basuma may not be what it meant in 1200 BC Babylon. But the persistence of the term across such a long span suggests it referred to something real, a category that mattered, even if its precise boundaries were disputed or fluid. If we read the texts as genealogical rather than mythological, one possible interpretation is that Anunnaki refers to the direct descendants of Anu through the primary line, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who inherited significant authority and territory. The Igigi then might refer to a subordinate line, perhaps descendants through secondary marriages, or the offspring of Anunnaki and non-Anunnaki unions, or simply junior members of the extended family who had not yet inherited major responsibilities. This would mirror the organisation of human royal families, where the sons of the king by his primary wife inherit the throne and the major titles, while the sons of secondary wives or concubines receive lesser positions, land grants, or administrative roles. The bloodline remains divine, but the authority is graded. The texts describe the Anunnaki as gathering in assembly to make decisions. This is not metaphorical. The tablets record specific procedures, the gods convene, a proposal is made, the gods debate, and a decree is issued. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal documents in history, states in its prologue that the great gods, Anu, Enlil, Marduk, gathered and called Hammurabi by name to establish justice in the land. The king's authority derives from this divine assembly. He is executing their decisions, not his own. If the Anunnaki were real, this describes a governing council, a family meeting where the senior members discuss policy, allocate resources, resolve disputes, and issue directives. The decisions are then implemented by subordinates, priests, kings, administrators, who serve as intermediaries between the divine council and the human population. This structure appears again and again in Mesopotamian administrative texts. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was an economic hub, a warehouse, a distribution centre. The priests managed vast estates, employed workers, collected taxes, and redistributed resources. They kept detailed records: who received how much grain, who worked how many days, who owed what to whom. These records survive by the tens of thousands, and they are bureaucratic to the point of tedium. They are not mythological, they are accounting. And at the top of this bureaucratic structure sat the god, or rather the god's household. The temple was called the house of the god. Offerings were described as feeding the god. The god's statue was dressed, bathed, and paraded through the city during festivals. All of this was taken literally. The god resided in the temple. The god required sustenance and maintenance. The god's household staff carried out the necessary tasks. If the Anunnaki were beings, not metaphors, not abstract forces, but actual individuals with physical presence, then the temple system makes sense as infrastructure designed to house and support them. The offerings were not symbolic, they were logistical support. The priests were not enacting rituals for human psychological benefit, they were fulfilling contractual obligations to a real employer. This reading is speculative and not accepted in mainstream scholarship, which understands Mesopotamian religion as polytheistic worship of anthropomorphic deities, gods imagined in human form and given human attributes, but not actual physical beings. But the texts themselves resist this interpretation in subtle ways. They are too detailed, too procedural, too concerned with logistics and bloodlines and administrative hierarchy. The genealogy is the key. If the Anunnaki were merely mythological, the genealogies would not need to be so precise. You would not need to track who bore children to whom across multiple generations. You would not need to preserve the names of minor gods who have no cult, no myths, no function except to appear in a family tree. But if the point is to document an actual bloodline, to preserve the record of who descended from Anu, who married whom, who inherited what, then the compulsive detail makes sense. The Anak-Anu list is not a theological text. It is an archive, a registry of bloodlines, a record of who belongs to the family and in what capacity. And like any genealogical archive, it includes everyone, the famous and the obscure, the powerful and the minor, the direct heirs and the distant cousins. Because the point is not to celebrate the important members, The point is to document the entire family. If this interpretation has any merit, then the question becomes, what happened to the Anunnaki? If they were real, where did they go? The texts describe their presence in Sumer and Babylon for thousands of years, and then, gradually, they fade. The temples fall into disrepair. The rituals are no longer performed. The cult centres are abandoned. By the time of the Persian conquest of Babylon, in the 6th century BC, the old gods are already becoming historical curiosities. By the time of Alexander the Great, they are relics. Did the Anunnaki die? Did they leave? Did they merge so completely with the human population through intermarriage that they ceased to exist as a distinct category? The texts do not say. But there is one more piece of the genealogy to examine before we can attempt an answer. One more thread to trace. The intersection of the divine bloodline with human kingship. Because if the Anunnaki were real, and if they intermarried with humans, then some living people carry their genes. Some bloodlines trace back, however distantly, to Anu. And the evidence for that claim is preserved in the most peculiar document in all of Mesopotamian literature, the Sumerian king list. The king list anomaly. The Well-Blundell prism, catalogued as WB444, sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. It is a clay prism roughly 8 inches tall, inscribed on all 4 sides with columns of cuneiform text. The document is known to scholars as the Sumerian king list, a chronological record of the rulers of Sumer and Akkad, arranged by city and dynasty, extending backward from the historical period into a time the text describes as before the flood. The list begins with a statement: when kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The use of lowered, not invented, not claimed, not seized, but lowered from heaven, is significant. Kingship is described as a divine gift, something that descends from the gods to the human realm. And the first city to receive it was Eridu, the city of Enki, the oldest settlement in Sumer. The text then lists the first kings. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaujar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The pattern continues through several cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larag, Sippar, Shurapak, listing 8 kings in total before the flood. Their combined reign is 241,200 years. These numbers are impossible. No human being lives 28,800 years, let alone rules for that long. Scholars have proposed various explanations. The numbers are symbolic, representing not actual years, but some other unit of time. The list is mythological, not historical, and the impossible reigns mark the pre-flood kings as legendary rather than real. The numbers represent dynasties or eras. Rather than individual rulers, the figures are corrupted through repeated copying, and the original list had more reasonable durations. All of these explanations are plausible, but none of them fully account for the precision of the numbers. These are not round figures. They are not many years or a long time. They are specific: 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. The numbers are consistently divisible by 3,600, a figure that had special significance in Sumerian mathematics, known as a sar, the largest counting unit in their sexagesimal 60 system. If we treat the list as a corrupted record, a historical document whose numbers have been distorted through transmission or misunderstood through changes in measurement systems, what kind of distortion would produce these results? One possibility: the original list recorded reigns in years, but a later scribe recorded reigns in years, but a later scribe, working in a different numerical system or copying from a damaged source, misread the figures, adding zeros or multiplying values. Another possibility: the reigns were originally recorded in a different unit, lunar months, seasons, or some other calendar measure, and were later converted incorrectly into years. But there is a third possibility, one that mainstream scholarship does not seriously entertain. The numbers are accurate, but they do not describe human rulers. If the pre-flood kings were Anunnaki, or part Anunnaki hybrids with extended lifespans, then the impossibly long reigns become less impossible. They remain extraordinary, but they shift from mythological to biological, a different species with a different lifespan ruling before the human-only dynasties began. The text itself suggests a break at the flood. After listing the 8 pre-flood kings and their enormous reigns, the list states, then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship is lowered from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. But now the reigns become shorter. Still extraordinary by modern standards, some kings rule for hundreds of years, but not tens of thousands, and as the list progresses forward in time, the reigns continue to decrease. By the time we reach the historically verified kings of the 3rd millennium BC, rulers whose names appear in archaeological records, whose monuments have been excavated, the reign lengths are plausible: 20 years, 30 years, 45 years. The pattern is a gradual normalization. The further forward in time you go, the more human the kings become. The earlier you go, the more they resemble something else. And the breakpoint, the flood, marks the transition. This flood is not unique to the king list. It appears in the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and eventually in the biblical account of Noah. In every version, the flood is sent by the gods to destroy humanity, and one man is warned and survives by building a boat. After the flood, the world is repopulated, but something has changed. In the Sumerian versions, kingship must be re-established. The cities must be rebuilt. The relationship between gods and humans is renegotiated. If the flood represents a real catastrophic event, and geological and archaeological evidence does suggest massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, then the king list may be documenting a transition from one kind of governance to another. Before the flood, rulers with impossibly long reigns, possibly Anunnaki or their direct offspring. After the flood, rulers with decreasing lifespans, representing the gradual dilution of the divine bloodline through successive generations of intermarriage with purely human populations. The king list explicitly identifies some post-flood kings as demigods. Gilgamesh, the famous king of Uruk, is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father was Lugalbanda, a mortal king. This makes Gilgamesh a hybrid, part Anunnaki, part human, and the text treats this as literal fact, not metaphor. Gilgamesh is stronger than normal humans, lives longer, can withstand hardships that would kill ordinary men. He is a demigod, not in the abstract, but in the biological sense, he possesses attributes of both lineages. Other kings claim similar ancestry. Royal inscriptions frequently reference divine parentage, son of Enlil, beloved of Inanna, chosen by Shamash. Some of these claims are clearly rhetorical, emphasizing divine favour rather than biological descent, but others specify maternal or paternal lineage in ways that suggest literal kinship. A king does not merely serve Inanna, he is born of her bloodline. He does not merely worship Enlil, he descends from Enlil's family. If the Anunnaki were real, this intermarriage would explain how their bloodline persisted even as they themselves withdrew or diminished in presence. The genes would continue through human descendants, diluted, increasingly recessive, but present. And kingship would be the mechanism by which that bloodline was preserved and concentrated. Royalty does not marry randomly. Royal families intermarry to maintain purity of lineage, to consolidate power, to preserve inherited traits. If divine ancestry conferred real advantages, longer life, greater strength, enhanced intelligence, then kings would have every incentive to marry others with similar ancestry, creating dynasties that maintained as much of the Anunnaki bloodline as possible. This is speculation, but it is speculation grounded in what the texts actually say. They say the gods took human wives. They say some humans were born of divine fathers. They say kingship was a divine gift. lowered from heaven pass through bloodlines that trace back to Anu. They say all of this repeatedly, consistently, across thousands of years and hundreds of texts. The only question is whether we take them literally or metaphorically. Bloodlines and human kingship. The city of Uruk, in its height during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCA, was home to perhaps 50,000 people, an extraordinary population for its time, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Its walls, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, were built by Gilgamesh himself, stretching for miles around the city. Archaeological excavations have confirmed the existence of these walls, massive structures requiring decades of labour and sophisticated engineering. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk around 2700 BC, according to the conventional chronology. The Sumerian king list places him in the first dynasty of Uruk, giving him a reign of 126 years. His deeds, his friendship with Enkidu, his journey to the cedar forest, his quest for immortality are recorded in one of the oldest surviving epic narratives in human literature. But the text describes him not as an ordinary king, but as a being of mixed nature, 2/3 god, 1/3 human. His mother Ninsun was a goddess, daughter of Anu according to some sources, associated with wisdom and dream interpretation. His father, Lugalbanda, was a mortal king, though himself described in texts as having divine protection and extraordinary abilities. The combination produced Gilgamesh, a hybrid whose strength and endurance exceeded human norms, but who was still mortal, still vulnerable, still subject to death despite his divine blood. The epic records Gilgamesh's anguish at this condition. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is confronted with his own mortality. He journeys to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh demands to know how he too can escape death. Utnapishtim tells him it is impossible. The immortality granted to Utnapishtim was a unique exception, bestowed once and never again. Gilgamesh tries and fails several tests. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, resigned to mortality, his divine blood insufficient to save him from death. This narrative only makes sense if the divine-human distinction is biological, not metaphorical. Gilgamesh's divine ancestry gives him advantages, but it does not make him fully divine. He is stronger, wiser, longer lived than ordinary humans, but he is not immortal. The bloodline is diluted. 2/3 is not enough. Other kings made similar claims. Gudea, ruler of the city-state Lagash, around 2144-2124 BCE, commissioned numerous statues of himself with inscriptions describing his relationship to the gods. He was called Shepherd Chosen by Ningirsu, a war god identified with Ninurta, son of Enlil. Gudea's inscriptions describe dreams in which the gods spoke to him directly, giving him architectural plans for temples, instructing him in governance. His relationship to the divine was intimate, personal, familial. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king famous for his law code 1792-1750, described himself in the prologue to those laws as the one called by name by Marduk, chosen to establish justice by the gods themselves. The relief at the top of the stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The symbolism is explicit. Hammurabi's authority derives from divine delegation. He is implementing the will of the gods, not his own. But many royal inscriptions go further than delegation. They claim kinship. Kings of Ur identified themselves as sons of Nana, the moon god. Kings of Uruk claimed descent from Inanna. These were not merely titles or religious flattery. They were genealogical claims, assertions that the royal bloodline traced back through human and divine ancestors to the Anunnaki themselves. If these claims are taken literally, then human kingship in Mesopotamia was never purely human. It was always a hybrid institution, with rulers whose legitimacy derived from carrying, however distantly, the blood of Anu. The institution of sacred kingship, widespread across ancient civilizations, may have originated not as religious symbolism but as biological fact. Certain families possess traits inherited from a non-human ancestor species, and those traits made them suitable to rule. This interpretation remains speculative and is not endorsed by mainstream scholarship, but it explains aspects of ancient kingship that otherwise seem puzzling. The obsessive attention to royal genealogy, the prohibition against commoners ascending to the throne, the practice of royal incest and dynastic intermarriage, the belief that kings possessed special qualities, wisdom, strength, divine favour that ordinary people lacked. If those qualities were genetic, inherited from an Anunnaki ancestor, then all of these practices make practical sense. They are methods for preserving and concentrating a valuable bloodline. 3 ways to read a family tree. We have traced the family tree from its roots, Apsu and Tiamat Ananki, through the first generation of Anu's children, Enlil Enki Ninasag, through the second generation, Nana Utu Inanna Ereshkigal, into the branches that spread across Mesopotamia and eventually into human kingship. The tablets document this genealogy with remarkable consistency across thousands of years. They preserve names, relationships, offspring, marriages, territorial assignments, conflicts and successions. 3 interpretations present themselves. First, pure mythology. The Anunnaki are symbolic representations of natural forces and social structures. Anu is the sky, Ki is the earth, Enlil is the storm, Enki is water. Their relationships allegorize cosmic processes. Their children represent the next level of differentiation: sun, moon, stars, vegetation, underworld. The genealogy is a narrative framework for organizing theological concepts, not a record of actual beings. This is the mainstream scholarly position, well supported and intellectually rigorous. Second, encoded wisdom. The texts preserve ancient knowledge in narrative form: astronomy, agriculture, medicine, mathematics, social organization, personified as gods to make the knowledge memorable and transmissible across generations. The Anunnaki are mnemonic devices. Their genealogy encodes relationships between different domains of knowledge. The family tree is a conceptual map, not a biological record. This interpretation respects the sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization, while acknowledging that pre-literate and early literate cultures often embedded practical knowledge in mythological narratives. Third, preserved records. The texts document an actual non-human or advanced human civilization that ruled Mesopotamia in prehistoric times. The Anunnaki were real beings, whether extraterrestrial, a technologically advanced indigenous species, or the survivors of an earlier global civilization now lost. They intermarried with humans, producing hybrid offspring who became kings. The impossibly long lifespans in the king list reflect genuine biological differences. The detailed genealogies exist because bloodline mattered in determining authority, ability and status. Over centuries, the bloodline diluted through intermarriage until the Anunnaki disappeared as a distinct category, leaving only their texts, their architecture, and their genetic legacy in certain human lineages. Each interpretation has strengths and weaknesses. The first is safest, most compatible with modern scientific understanding, least likely to veer into pseudoscience. The second honours the intelligence of ancient peoples while avoiding supernatural claims. The third takes the texts at face value but requires extraordinary claims about human prehistory. What is undeniable is this: someone in ancient Mesopotamia cared deeply about preserving these genealogies. Someone copied them century after century, even when the gods were no longer actively worshipped. Someone organised them into systematic lists, cross-referenced variants, maintained archives. The Ansklik Anum God list represents hundreds of hours of scholarly labour, compiling, organising, preserving relationships and names. Why? If it was pure fiction, why such precision? If it was encoded knowledge, why frame it as bloodlines rather than principles? And if it was a historical record, Why did later civilizations, Persians, Greeks, Romans, dismiss it as mythology? Perhaps because by the time those later civilizations arrived, the Anunnaki were already gone, and the texts had indeed become mythology. Or perhaps because acknowledging the texts as history would require acknowledging that human civilization was not the first, or only, or most advanced intelligence on this planet. That is a disturbing thought. It is easier to call it myth. The name's still written in clay. In the cool darkness of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, beneath layers of security and preservation, CBS 10673 remains where we began. The clay is dry now, hardened over millennia, the wedge-shaped marks pressed by a scribe's stylus still visible, still readable. The tablet lists names, relationships, generations. It does so with bureaucratic precision, the kind of precision you find in archives, not in poetry. Someone thought this information was worth preserving, worth copying, worth passing down through centuries even as cities fell and languages changed. The genealogy of the Anunnaki survived the fall of Sumer, the rise of Babylon, the conquest of Assyria, the arrival of Persia. It survived because scribes kept copying it, priests kept teaching it, scholars kept studying it. What were they preserving? A mythology? Perhaps. A cultural memory? Possibly. A historical record? We may never know for certain. What we do know is this. The tablets describe a family tree that begins with beings called Anunnaki, children of Anu, descended from sky and earth, who divided the world among themselves, who governed cities, who created humanity, who intermarried with humans, and whose bloodlines spread across Mesopotamia until it became indistinguishable from human kingship itself. Whether that description is literal history, symbolic narrative, or something in between, the texts insist on one thing: the bloodline mattered. Who descended from whom? Who bore children to whom? Who inherited authority from whom? Somewhere in that insistence lies a truth about how the ancients understood themselves, their rulers, their origins. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, kings, aliens, or memories of something older than recorded history, the Sumerians believed they were real. They preserved their names with the same care we preserve the names of our own ancestors. They mapped their family tree with the precision of genealogists documenting royalty. And on clay tablets in museums around the world, that family tree remains. Anu and Ki at the root, branches spreading through Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, extending through their children and grandchildren, reaching into human kingship, preserved in wedge-shaped marks that have outlasted empires. The bloodline is written in clay. The interpretation is left to you. Wherever you are, whatever hour of night or day finds you now, the question remains open. Were these gods, metaphors, or memories? The tablets cannot answer, they can only preserve. And in preservation, they offer this gift, the possibility that beneath the mythology lies history, that beneath the poetry lies precision, that somewhere in the family tree of the Anunnaki is the record of something that actually happened, something our ancestors considered important enough to write down, copy, preserve, and pass to us across 4,000 years. Sleep now, if you wish. Let the name settle. Let the genealogy unfold in the quiet spaces of thought. And if this investigation resonated with you, if these questions linger after the video ends, leave a trace of your presence, a comment, a like, a signal that you are here, listening, considering, wandering alongside the ancient scribes who pressed these names into clay. The family tree of the Anunnaki is complete. The interpretation is yours.